Today I'm going to give you a quick tour of this beautiful backyard garden here in Cypress, Texas. This garden is less than 2 years old, and it definitely has not reached maturity yet, and showing the progress of what has already become established in a garden this young. And one of the things is this pathway that goes around the pool. It was actually put in for the dog, so they were very concerned with when they put in the pool and added landscape if the dog was going to trample plants. And it is a legitimate concern, and it is something that has to be worked around. So when you're dealing with big dogs and small landscape, it can be a challenge to get that established, especially when the dog was here before the landscape. And the things that I have been planting along this pathway have all been planted strategically to keep guiding her through the landscape without damaging plants. But there have been a few things along the way that still got a little bit of damage. I'm going to go down this path and kind of name the plants along this pathway, and when I get to the plant that she has trampled or that there's damage, I will be sure to point that out. What I want to start off sharing is the reason for these banana trees. The client really wanted to go for a tropical vibe and still have a landscape that looked good all year. So since most tropical plants die back in the winter, there had to be a compromise of a balance of evergreens and bright colored plants and big leaves such as this banana tree. But I will say the landscape that they're taking up, the real estate area, is quite a lot. They are being prioritized by having this whole corner of the full sun area. The banana trees will probably become high maintenance over the years, having to be thinned out routinely and aggressively because the stalks will start to creep in on the landscape. He is aware of that, and I explained that to him, and he was still good with the choice of banana trees. So back here, there's a Nandina. It's a firepower Nandina, and down to the right over here is another dwarf Yaupon, and in front of the Nandina right here is another yellow carex. After the banana trees, we have a boxwood that I hope once it matures will be able to shape like a giant bonsai. This is a variegated ligustrum that will get about 10 feet tall once it matures. Right below that is a variegated lantana. And around the variegated lantana are some dianthus and some annual zinnias, just some of the dwarf variety that I installed randomly down the path starting last year, and then I added a few more colors this year. In between the stepping stones, I've installed mazes. So as I go along the path and you see the bright green colored leaves, that will be the mazes, and it's called mazes reptans, which means creeping along the ground. Right past the variegated ligustrum is this little dwarf Pittosporum, and it has turned out to be one of my favorite shrubs along this side. It's mounding in such a nice, tidy habit, but I will say this is also one of the plants that got trampled, I want to say about a year ago. The dog stepped right in the middle, broke the center branch that was coming up and filling in. There was a big hole in it for a long time, is because since we were introducing this pathway around that time, I mean, it takes several months for the dog to get used to being steered where you want them to. So during that process, there's going to be a little mishaps. And I will say, just considering that this is probably the only mishap on this side that gave an eyesore for a while, since that's one of my favorite bushes, I'm really glad that nothing else has happened to it. Yellow puffy grasses that are also along the pathway are a yellow carex. Then here is a dwarf mounding lantana, more Yaupons. This is the first night purple fountain grass, and it's going to get a few feet tall before fall, but it looks really nice in this landscape and also helps add to that tropical vibe. So just a few feet in front of this purple fountain grass is some more dwarf Yaupons, and those two are planted about every 7 to 8 feet around the pool as well with the Lorope. And then there's also a mounding dwarf lantana here, and I've scattered a few of the dwarf zinnias along the path for extra color. And then I have been working in some perennials. So the first year what I did is I planted annuals in the places where I would like to see perennials, and then I watched to see how they held up. And basically the annuals that didn't get trampled was where I felt comfortable putting perennials later in the year and this year. And I've added these angelonias and I've added this hibiscus, all by using that strategy. So that's what you will see here is the dwarf zinnias are kind of scattered throughout, because those are the annuals that I started with as test plants to see if she would stay on the path. I have this purple leaf hibiscus. There's some more yellow carex here. This year I incorporated these lilies. They're really beautiful. There's also a lot of cosmos that I've just sprinkled throughout here just to add some color. Right here in the path there is some trailing verbena and some more of the yellow carex. This is a Nandina. There's some new sprouts coming, so I'm going to try and take extra measures to keep that area open for sunlight so it can fill in a little better. And then along this edge, it's just kind of a mixture of random perennials and annuals, because right behind where this planting area is, there is going to be some sort of structure that's not built yet. And so until that structure is here, it's not a good idea to put anything permanent. So everything here is just temporary until that structure is built. Everything from here down the side of the pool is actually a permanent part of the landscape. If the pathway is allowed to become too overgrown, the dog will be less likely to recognize it as an open spot. So the goal is that when the dog is scanning the yard, it can immediately recognize this area as being open for her to run. So that's the point of being sure to maintain the pathway of where you're trying to guide your dog or pet to run if you are trying to establish a landscape while having a pet that roams the yard. So this plant that I am trimming up here is an Evergreen Wisteria. It's not exactly the focal point it was put here to be just yet, but this is a work in progress. So my vision for the wisteria is hopes to have it cascading down the fence, kind of like the wind's blowing it in one direction. Hoping for the trunk area to get mature over the next year or two and much thicker so it can make a prominent statement and be a really strong focal point for this part of the yard all year long. Just because that's what I'm envisioning does not mean that's how it's going to play out, but that's the idea that I'm hoping for, but only time will tell. And if it doesn't turn out the way that I'm hoping, at least you can see why. If you happen to follow along and subscribe, you'll be able to see the process of how those decisions are made, whether it becomes a success or not. This is another boxwood, but it's, you know, something about it is just not looking right the past couple visits. I'm not sure what to make of it, but the goal is for these boxwoods to eventually become a structural element of the garden that resembles an oversized bonsai. This client really likes things with a Japanese flair and style. So he actually has a little bonsai garden. So this is, you know, to try and just incorporate that idea and that look along the landscape. Now, I don't know if it's going to play out that way, but that's just, again, something we're envisioning that we can hope. We've already lost one boxwood to blight from this landscape since it's been installed, so I don't know how much that's going to become a problem, but fingers crossed it doesn't become a problem and everything from here on out is smooth sailing. This pathway wraps around the entire property. And the reason for that is because that's where the dog was used to roaming. So this garden tour is also going to follow this pathway. And throughout here, this part of the pathway, you can see the mazes has gotten really established and it's looking really nice, green and filled in. We're very happy with how good of a job it's doing of stabilizing the path, keeping the dirt and mulch in place, and making sure to keep erosion to a minimum, because around this entire pool, the grade is very steep for drainage because, one, the yard is very small. We didn't have a lot of space to work with. But when they put in the pool, they had to put very good drainage off the side of it. So everything is planted on somewhat of a slope, while the pathway is about 70% down the bottom of the slope, all the way around the pool. So there was a concern with, as things settled over time, the pathway becoming unstable. And every now and then, since it's put in, I have just had to pull up a couple stones here and there to kind of level them out when I'm doing mulch. And so twice in the past 2 years, having to do that in a few areas is not a big concern. So it's not a big deal that these are just flagstones laid on the ground. Having the right pathway plants between the flagstones makes a big difference in the long-term stability of the soil and the stone together, and how everything can kind of be held in place, especially when you go with a plant like mazes that is an evergreen and spreading, and it's so compact. It does a great job at keeping out weeds too. At a glance, and if you squint your eyes, it looks like moss, and this is the closest thing to moss that we can grow in our region, especially in our heat when I first installed this garden, I only had a few patches of the mazes in. And last fall, I spread a little down in that direction, and then this spring, I moved a little more in this direction, and this corner was actually eroding a lot. I had a hard time keeping the stones stable and the mulch in place, so I started transitioning the mazes to this end of the path, and it has done a great job of not only stabilizing everything, but filling in and keeping out weeds. But I just love the way this is filled in. I really love it. The owner loves it. It's an evergreen. I just can't say enough about this plant. And I think I saw some little flowers on here. They look best in the morning, but there's some right there. And it's just a couple. Sometimes you'll come out and it'll be covered in those little blue flowers. It's just a nice little surprise. But I think this plant is pretty without the flowers just by itself. The flowers are just a plus. So just off the side of this path is a pineapple guava shrub. And being less than 2 years old, it's looking good. And I think I saw one flower on it this year, but that's nothing to write home about or get excited, because I do think it's going to take about 3 years before it will start producing any notable fruit. Along this side of the pool, the pathway transitions into a shade garden because there is a big row of mature crepe myrtles that were here before any of this was. And off this path where it starts to transition into shade is where I planted some turmeric, which is the curcuma ginger, some dwarf elephant ears. There's some more variegated phlox there. There's also a cordyline, another Nandina, and this is a dwarf yopon. And then along here, this edge of the path, there's a short ground cover called Mercedonia, and I hope I'm saying it right, but it is in one of my videos for the first bloomers up for each year, and Mercedonia is one of the first spring bloomers every year, and it just covers itself with these bright little cheery flowers. I absolutely love it. It doesn't do much the rest of the year, but it is still worth having in the garden because it is another evergreen, but I believe it might bloom in the fall too, but I do know it is definitely one of the first bloomers of spring. You can see on this pathway, I've been extending the mazes over the last year as far as it will grow, and I can tell there is a deep color change that occurs the more it transitions into shade. And then when it's in too deep of shade, the mounding is not quite as intense and it's a little more sparse, and it doesn't do a good job of keeping out weeds. And in that area, I have started to incorporate chocolate chip ajuga, which I know is a great path filler. So the transition from mazes to ajuga is actually going to be a mix of however the plants decide to commingle. So I'm really excited to see how that plays out. But the area where I'm going to transition from the chocolate chip ajuga to the mazes, from the shade to the sun, I'm just going to keep adding both plants at an equal rate to this area and let whatever wins win. Because there's no way for me to gauge exactly where that transition is best for each plant. So I'm just going to let the plants battle it out themselves and fill in however they fill in. One will do really good and one won't. And the path in this area will probably end up being an interesting mix of both plants together, but again, we'll just have to see how that plays out. So as the pathway ends right here and it meets into the pool, there is a drainage right there where I just did a little decorative design with stones because the pipe was cut before the garden was installed and they cut the pipe too low. So I had to kind of work with what was there and get something that just made the water drain this way and then still look good without seeing the drain because the pipe was cut way too soon. The other ones, the other drainage holes that they left the pipes a good foot high while we installed the landscape to make sure that we could cut the drainage at the right height. However, somebody got a little excited and cut the pipe too soon. Gives a little focal point to enter the pathway right there and camouflages the drain with something that looks better than a drain. Just past the first crepe myrtle is some lorope that's planted, another cordyline, and then I've got some hidden ginger. That is the Bangkok ruby that I'm going to install under this tree. Back here in this corner, there are some white caladiums, some Turk's cap, some of the Arabian jasmine, some upright elephant ears, and some more curcuma and Nandina. And again, lorope. This little bush here is an azalea that makes the most beautiful color lavender flower that the dog has trampled quite a few times. When it comes to this area of the garden, because the squirrels right next to the trees love to run along this fence, from the fence to the trees, and the dog goes crazy. So we've had a lot more trampling going on in this area. This section right here is between the first two crepe myrtles as we move to the shade garden from the pool. And I have some Feather Falls carex in here, and that is the strong white variegated grass. There is some giant ajuga here in front with some caladiums and amaryllis. And then right here is a stone structure that was just made with some tree stumps and some flagstone to create a tabletop-like area for him to place all his bonsais. Before I put in this garden, the bonsais were just kind of scattered out in a bunch of different areas. And sometimes they just kind of got lost in the landscape. So this way they have a designated area altogether. Along the ground, along this whole shade path, is mondo grass and chocolate chip ajuga. And a mixture of lorope with some amaryllis throughout. Excuse me, Chevelle. This is the doggy. This is the dog that runs through the garden. Come and show everybody who you are. Come here. This is Chevelle. Yeah, this is hers. And this is why we have trouble growing stuff, because Chevelle likes to trample plant. She's bringing me her toy. Okay, and it's soaking wet. Okay. So anyway, this is the risk I'm taking. She's used to maneuvering around it. Okay, so just to give you an idea of the orientation of where we are in this garden tour, the pool is that way, and then this is the path that led into the shade garden, and then the pathway leads to the patio. So here's the little bonsai garden, and right here is where I just planted the two hostas. So the pathway kind of comes around and it meets the pool, and then she can use the patio, and then she can use the path there to run close to that fence where the squirrels are. It just didn't work out that way. She decided she wants to run along this fence no matter what. So one of the really pretty azaleas is here, and she has trampled it for a year nonstop at least before I finally found something. So that's really good news, and I'm really excited that I found something that works for the most part, but I just need to modify it a little bit more for this one, since it seems to be in the most fragile place that the dog likes to run. These are some African irises that I planted from the very beginning, and I was putting them here to try to steer her away from hitting this coming from that direction. And yeah, she just tramples right on through here. The other plants that run along this back fence area are some more turmeric and some upright elephant ears, some lorope. There is some more Feather Falls carex grass in the front right there. And then here is the azalea with some mondo grass and some hostas that I just planted. Between the dog and the shade and the lack of sunlight, it is a pretty tough area. As for the shade garden goes, this is the second to last crepe myrtle that's planted along this row. So we're going to start to exit the deepest part of the shade garden and get into something that I consider part sun, part shade. So in this area, I have another one of those azaleas with the fence around it, and this one is doing really good. But the pathway for the dog continues on from this point and runs all the way down to the end where the pond is, the pathway that turns into the dry creek bed that helps keep the drainage in check for this yard. This is the essential drainage area. This side of the yard used to be very muddy and mucky, and it was grass before. It was a little section of lawn, but it always stayed really soggy, and it was just ugly and boring. Another passion that the client had is potting succulents, and again, he had those kind of scattered out in different places throughout his patio and garden. They all seemed a bit lost, let me just say that, in the landscape. And then they were also in areas that weren't quite the conditions that they needed. Since I found out that area of the yard is part sun, part shade, I decided to take advantage of that and build a small structure or set of structures out of the flagstone that we used for the path to have all his succulents displayed in pots. Things that I want to point out quick along this pathway would be the chocolate chip ajuga that's establishing nicely, and then this is just the regular lorope, mondo grass, the purple yew, and then I've also started a patch of the variegated ajuga, one of my favorites. And then there's some more variegated phlox. So this is the area where the pathway transitions into a dry creek bed and curves around the surface areas that were built for these succulent pots. And the way everything came together, it actually, it looks really nice, and it was kind of done on a whim. This didn't have a hard set of plans. I just knew that I needed to find a place to bring all the succulents together because they show much better together as a group or a collection than they do scattered out around the yard. So I'm very pleased with how this collection is displayed in this way along the dry creek bed. And they really complement each other, the rocky area of the creek bed and then the variety of pots that he's chosen with bright colors. It's different than I would have planned as far as the color scheme, but it works. He's happy, he loves it, and it does bring a bright brightness over here that we couldn't get with plants to begin with. The furthest end of this creek bed, at the very end where the drainage has to take a sharp turn to leave the yard, is where in this corner is kind of a mix of sun and shade that changes at different times of the year. So we're still kind of experimenting with what will work here. And then along the back fence here is the same thing. There's some lorope, some Mexican heather, and some more milkweed. Here's a Nandina. There's a little bitty dwarf succulent yew plant that's kind of been mounding around some of these areas of the creek bed that look really nice. Here's some more upright elephant ears, periwinkles, some caladiums. There's a dwarf yaupon. Here is the patch of the succulent collection. And then on this side of the creek bed is some mondo grass, some chocolate chip ajuga, some Mercedonia, and I'm going to allow that Mercedonia to grow on both sides and cover the ground as much as possible and creep up this way as much as possible, because even if it grows over these rocks right here, it's not enough to impede the water. So that's the important thing, that so a plant like ajuga, if this one starts growing within the rocks, it could potentially slow down the water flow because it gets that thick. And that is it for this garden tour in Cypress, Texas. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I hope to see you again here on Garden Beauty.